Some people left this world more than 2,000 years ago, and yet their names still refuse to lie still beneath the thin dust of time. They continue to echo in books, in speeches, in the dreams of power cherished by those who come after, and even in the whispered warnings about human ambition. Julius Caesar is such a name. He was not merely a man who lived, fought, triumphed, and fell. He is a name like a small flame that has never fully gone out, at times only smoldering beneath the ashes, yet all it takes is a light wind from history, and it flares up once more. Tonight, on Deep Sleep of Power, we will not hurry straight into the thunder of hooves, the clash of swords, or the smoke-drenched fields of war. We will move more slowly than that. Slowly, like someone carrying a small lamp through the old stone corridors of ancient Rome, where the light is not strong enough to expose everything at once, but just enough for each line to emerge, soft, profound, and haunting. To understand Julius Caesar, perhaps we cannot look only at the moment he crossed the Rubicon or fell beneath the knives on the Ides of March. We must go farther back, into a quieter place, to watch how a name gradually grew until it became a symbol of supreme power. What made Caesar different from so many other famous men of antiquity was not simply how many battles he won, or how many political doors he forced open before him. Something deeper lies here. He never officially wore the crown of an emperor, and yet it was his very face that opened the path to an entire imperial age. After him, many rulers of the world longed to borrow light from that name. Caesar slowly ceased to be only the name of one man. It became a title, an ambition, a dream for those who wished to stand higher than the crowd and compel their age to move according to their will. Perhaps that is why the story of Caesar has never truly ended. Every age reads him differently. Some see in him a military genius. Some see a daring reformer. Others see a vast shadow cast over an aging republic. And there are also those who quietly ask, in the end, is a society saved by the extraordinary strength of one individual, or preserved by the limits that no one is permitted to cross? If you love stories like these, stories that move slowly, deeply, and leave their echo long after the screen has gone dark, please offer a small gesture of support to Deep Sleep of Power by subscribing to the channel. Each follow from you is a small lamp kept burning in this room, so that together we may continue to go deeper into the lives that changed the course of history. And now, as the night grows quieter, as the footsteps of the present seem to have withdrawn a little farther away, let us return to ancient Rome. Not the Rome of victories carved in stone, but the Rome of legends told within the family, of bloodlines believed to carry a promise from the gods. Before Julius Caesar became the great wind that shook an entire republic, he was once a child growing up in a cloak woven from legend. There are children who grow up in houses with low-tiled roofs, modest meals, and very small stories, only enough to warm a cold night. But there are also children who grow up surrounded by stories told, as though the whole sky itself were bending down over their cradle. Julius Caesar seems to have belonged to the second kind. He was born into the Julii, an ancient noble family of Rome, not the wealthiest, nor always the most powerful at that particular moment. Yet they possessed a kind of invisible inheritance that not everyone had. A story of origin. The Julii believed, or at least wanted others to believe, that they were descendants of Julius, the son of Aeneas, the hero of Troy who survived the ashes of war and carried his bloodline to Italy. and Aeneas, in Roman legend, was in turn the son of the goddess Venus. It is hard to know in what tone those stories were told inside their household. Perhaps in the sound of a small fire, in the flicker of oil lamps, in the voice of an elder, carrying the calm assurance of someone who believes they are speaking of something that needs no proof. But whatever tone was used, stories like these always carry a strange weight in the mind of a child. For when a child grows up with the feeling that his ancestors were not merely human, but somehow touched mythology, he may easily carry within himself a quiet belief that his own life should not end in mediocrity. Perhaps that was one of the first things that shaped Julius Caesar. Not a clear command, not a thunderous prophecy, but rather an atmosphere of being chosen, something that entered the mind slowly, like the scent of pine resin seeping into cloth. From a very early age, he lived in a world where blood was not merely lineage, but also a political story. Origin, in ancient Rome, was not simply a matter of genealogy. It was the light cast upon a name, the cloak draped over an identity, the backdrop that made a person's ambition appear more rightful in the eyes of others. And that, too, is worth reflecting on, for power very rarely stands upon swords or wealth alone. More often, it needs a story to wear. It needs an origin beautiful enough, a symbol elevated enough, a myth ancient enough to turn ambition into something that seems almost preordained. Caesar was born close to that lesson. Before he learned how to conquer men with words, before he learned how to arrange an army or write a victory in a few short lines, perhaps he had already learned something even more fundamental, that people are ruled not only by strength, but also by what others believe about them. Of course, between myth and truth, there is always a quiet distance. The Julii may have linked themselves to Aeneas and Venus, but Rome was not a city filled only with naive souls. There, everyone understood that legend was sometimes a kind of garment skillfully tailored for status. It was not necessarily a complete falsehood. It was something that existed between belief, symbol, and political necessity. The Romans lived with myth the way they lived with the statues of gods in the public squares. They did not always need to ask whether stone was truly divine. It was enough to know that such a statue could make people lift their heads, bow themselves, and behave differently. So when we look at Caesar's childhood, we should not ask too quickly whether he truly believed every layer of myth surrounding his family. The deeper question is perhaps this: what did he learn from living inside those myths? And the answer may be this: he learned that in politics, image is not decoration, it is part of power. A man who knows how to clothe himself in the right symbol can enter a room with an entirely different light around him. There is another legend about Caesar himself that has endured for many centuries, that he was born by cutting open his mother's womb, and that the word Caesarian later came from this. The story sounds fitting for a man who would one day become so great, a symbol that his name itself turned into a title. It makes even his birth seem destined to be extraordinary, as though from the very moment he entered the world, he had already chosen a path unlike that of other men. But history is a little more sober than legend. Many scholars believe this is unlikely to be true because his mother Aurelia seems to have lived quite a long time after giving birth to him, whereas such a procedure in the ancient world would have scarcely allowed the mother to survive. That detail does not make Caesar any smaller. On the contrary, it makes him more interesting. His life did not need a myth of birth in order to become great. Yet the fact that people kept wanting to attach an unusual beginning to him says a great deal. There are figures so immense that people cannot bear to let them enter the world as ordinary human beings do. Their aura shines backward as well, falling even upon the cradle. And perhaps it was precisely in such an environment, amid the dignity of old nobility, amid family myths, amid a Rome that was changing quickly while still clutching tightly to the memory of its ancestors, that Caesar began to absorb a very particular feeling, that he was not living only for today, but standing within a current far longer than himself. A person who carries such a feeling does not easily accept a quiet life. He is more likely to see in every door an invitation, in every limit an insult, in every opportunity a call of destiny. But myth, no matter how beautifully woven, only truly gains weight when it touches the ground. And Rome, that city of stone, dust, sweat, bargaining voices, and narrow streets crowded with people, would soon teach the boy of the Julii bloodline another lesson, that power does not live only in genealogies recited with solemn voices, but also breathes in the low streets, the cramped houses, the weary faces of the crowd, where the smell of ordinary life is not as fragrant as marble, yet lies closer to the heartbeat of the city than any temple ever could. There are lessons that do not come from teachers, do not lie in books, and do not resound from the speaker's platform. They come from the smell of the city, from the sound of people's footsteps pressing past one another on narrow roads, from the heat of small kitchens, from arguments outside the window, from faces so accustomed to hardship that even in silence they still carry a language of their own. If the bloodline of the Julii gave Julius Caesar the feeling that he had not been born for mediocrity, then Subura was perhaps the place that taught him that power, if it wishes to endure, cannot speak only in the voice of temples and ancient genealogies. Subura was one of the most crowded, noisy, and least fragrant districts of Rome. There was none of the quiet grace of sprawling villas there, none of the clean chill of freshly polished marble, none of the restraint of words too carefully weighed in council chambers. There, people lived so close to one another that breath, sound, smell, joy, and irritation almost blended together. Narrow alleys, tall apartment buildings prone to fire, taverns, street vendors, veterans carrying within themselves both war and disappointment, poor laborers, strangers from every direction pouring into Rome. All of it created a rhythm of life that was not beautiful in the manner of stone statues, yet was profoundly real in the manner of a beating heart. For a boy born into an ancient noble family, that must have been a very different kind of school. Here people cared little who your ancestors were, if your purse was empty, if their stomachs were hungry, if the laws of the state failed to reach their daily lives. Here, the honor of a family line might still be respected, but it was not enough to soften the resentment of those who felt excluded from the Republic's share of power. And perhaps it was in that atmosphere, at once burdensome and alive, that Caesar began to understand an important truth. Rome did not exist only in the Senate. Rome also lived in the crowd. That may sound simple to those who came later, but in the Roman world, it was an intuition with almost unlocking power, for the ancient republic was built upon law, ritual, office, lineage, and aristocratic networks. Yet beneath that solemn architecture lay a sea of people who could always redirect history if someone knew how to touch what they were waiting for. Subura, in its own way, taught Caesar that power does not always begin in the brightest places. Very often it gathers quietly in places that are damper, more chaotic, less fragrant, yet closer to human need than anything else. We may imagine a young man walking through crowded streets, hearing broken fragments of stories about debt, about land, about opportunities growing fewer in a city that was becoming larger and larger, though not everyone received a fair share of it. He may have seen men who once carried spears for Rome, now struggling in ordinary life. He may have seen families packed into buildings ready to collapse, while elsewhere, eloquent speeches about the honor of the Republic still rang out beautifully. That very distance between solemn words and suffocating life was where many future leaders learned a dangerous kind of knowledge. The knowledge that resentment can be guided. But it would not be enough merely to say that Caesar cared about the poor. That view is too simple, even naive. Something deeper, perhaps, is that he realized those left behind needed not only bread or promises. They needed to be seen, to be named within a story larger than their own narrow lives. And Caesar, from very early on, seems to have possessed that ability. The ability to make others feel that they were not merely the surplus of a city, but its true driving force. Perhaps in Subura, he also learned the rhythm of the crowd, not the abstract crowd of speeches, but the crowd of flesh and bone, easily moved, easily suspicious, easily hopeful, easily angered, yet also deeply sensitive to anyone who spoke in the right language. The crowd does not love distance for long. It is not forever conquered by cold dignity. It wants to feel that the person standing before it understands the smell of life. And perhaps for that reason, Caesar would later never belong entirely to only one class. He possessed aristocratic qualities, yet he knew how to step closer to those who felt themselves pushed to the margins of the Republic. This did not turn him into an innocent savior. It only shows that from early on, he understood an ancient rule that still feels modern. Whoever wishes to stand high must first know where the ground is cracking. Power endures not only through a strong sword or a beautiful ancestry. It endures when it knows how to place its hand upon the true wound of an age. And Subura, with all its dust, noise, and smell of sweat, gave Caesar his first lesson in that art. In neighborhoods like that, one also learns something else. That order is not always natural. It is fragile, always needing to be maintained, always capable of splitting when injustice has accumulated for too long. A city may appear great from a distance, but if one steps closer into its narrowest alleys, one will see the small fractures running beneath the stone. Perhaps it was here, amid walls pressed close together and lives never written into the chronicles, that Caesar began to absorb the feeling that Rome was not as secure as it imagined itself to be. And once a person has seen the first cracks in the foundation, he is rarely content merely to stand and admire the statues. From the smell of the streets to the heartbeat of the crowd, from the tightness of ordinary life to the intuition of political energy smoldering beneath the surface of the Republic, that young man was gradually stepping out of the cloak of family myth and placing his hand upon something more real, rougher, and also more powerful. But the city of Rome did not teach men only through poverty, noise, or accumulating resentment. Sometimes it was taught through fear itself, and there would come a very long night when power would no longer appear as a distant symbol, but as a real hand pressing against the throat of a young man, forcing him to choose between safe submission and dangerous solitude. There are turning points in a human life that do not arrive with thunder. They do not always open with war, do not necessarily require armies, smoke, fire or grand declarations. Sometimes they come in a closed room, in a brief command, in a choice that seems almost private, yet is enough to alter the direction of an entire destiny. For Julius Caesar, one such night came very early, when he was still a young man, without an army, without the radiance of victories, without a reputation great enough to make Rome turn its head. At that time, he possessed only a name still standing before its destiny, and a decision that made the greatest power of the age take notice of him. Rome then was living under the heavy shadow of Lucius Cornelius Sulla, a man who had come through civil war and become the symbol of absolute power in the form of a republic. He did not merely win battles, he also rearranged the order of things with a coldness that forced the whole city to learn again how to be silent. Lists of proscription, purges, knocks at the door late at night. All of it made Rome understand that there are periods in history when the law is no longer a net cast equally over everyone, but becomes a tool in the hands of the strongest man. It was within that atmosphere that Caesar fell under scrutiny, in part because of family ties, in part because of political connections that in those days were never truly harmless. He had married Cornelia, the daughter of Lucius Cornelius Cinna, a figure from the faction opposed to Sulla. And then the command was given. Caesar was to divorce. At first hearing, it may sound like a personal demand, but in truth it was far greater than that. In the Roman world, marriage among the aristocracy was not merely a matter of affection. It was an alliance, a signal, a position on the map of power. To force Caesar to leave Cornelia was not simply to make him change wives. It was a way of forcing him to declare that he accepted submission, accepted allowing outside power to enter the most private part of his life, accepted surrendering part of his own axis in exchange for safety. And Caesar refused. What is worth reflecting on here is this: that refusal should not be understood too simply as a fit of youthful stubbornness. Had it been mere recklessness, the act would have resembled a rash toss of the head before authority. But in Caesar, there seems to have been something else. It seems that from a very early age, he already felt that there were concessions which, once accepted, leave a hollow in the soul. There are moments of bowing that do not merely resolve an immediate danger, but quietly teach a person to grow accustomed to living beneath another's will. Perhaps he understood, even if he could not yet name it clearly, that if he allowed others to arrange his heart, his marriage, and his loyalties, then later it would be very difficult for him ever to stand upright in any greater storm. And so, that young man entered the first long night of his life. We may imagine him leaving familiar places, carrying little with him, not knowing for certain what the next day would bring. Not the kind of heroic flight found in epics, but something closer to the feeling of a young man understanding for the first time the true weight of power. Power, when far away, can look like a statue in the square. Immense, cold, somewhat abstract, but when it turns fully toward you, it becomes something very near, very real, like breath at the back of your neck, like a hand slowly closing off every escape. Those months could not have been easy. Caesar had to hide, to move, to taste the instability that did not suit someone raised with an awareness of family dignity. But it was also in that instability that something began to be forged into shape. Not military achievement, not fame, but an inner spine. For there is a great difference between someone who likes to appear strong and someone who can truly endure solitude. The first requires an audience, The second needs only to know that he has not betrayed himself. Caesar's night before Sulla perhaps belonged to the second kind. No one knows for certain what he thought in those hours. But from that darkness the outline begins to emerge, of a man who would many times in life choose the more dangerous road, if the safer road required him to become too small in his own eyes. In the end, thanks to the intervention of influential people, and perhaps also because Sulla did not yet see the need to uproot a tree still too young, Caesar was spared. But tradition tells that Sulla looked at the young man and said in essence that there were many Mariuses in him. Whether that line was polished by time or not in strictly historical terms, it still carries symbolic accuracy. Sulla seems to have recognized something that many others had not yet seen. Behind that youthful appearance was a will not easily bent, a man who, if he lived long enough, would never consent to remain merely an obedient shadow within another man's order. That is what was beautiful and also frightening about Caesar. He was not born from this moment as a fully formed hero, but here we can already see the early seed of a quality that would remain with him all his life. He did not easily surrender the right to define himself to others. Later, that quality would lift him very high. It would also drive him toward boundaries that ordinary men would not dare to cross. But in that first moment, it was simply a young man standing before a power far greater than himself, and choosing not to let fear decide in his place. And that is what gives this night more weight than many louder upheavals. For before a man learns how to command armies, subdue rivals, or tilt the balance of an entire republic, he usually must pass through a quieter test, whether he can keep his own voice when the whole world wishes to force him to speak in another tone. Rome had shown Caesar the cold face of power. But life does not test a man only through commands and persecution. Sometimes it places him amid the waves, amid the crude laughter of men who think they hold another's life in their hands. And then, in a scene where most people would know only fear, that young man would reveal yet another strange quality. Even in captivity, he behaved as though the final stage would one day belong to him. There are some people who, once placed in an unfavorable circumstance, reveal their true nature as clearly as a line that had always been waiting beneath the stone. In some, adversity makes them smaller. In others, it breaks them. But with Julius Caesar, adversity seems to have had a stranger effect. It did not cause him to disappear into the circumstance, but made him stand out more clearly, as though even in the hands of others, he still quietly preserved an inner center that no one could touch. One of the most famous anecdotes from Caesar's youth took place not in the Senate, not in a military camp, but on the open sea. At that time, he was still a young man traveling to continue his studies in rhetoric, not yet carrying a glory great enough to make all Rome bow its head. And yet the sea, which cares nothing for how much ambition a man possesses, gave him a very different trial. He was captured by pirates. For most people, that is the kind of event whose very thought is enough to make the heart grow a little cold. The endless water, a strange ship, rough faces, men who lived by plunder and did not regard human life as especially precious. In such a space, a young aristocrat, with no army beside him and no Rome behind him to offer protection, ought to have appeared as a hostage in the fullest sense of the word. Anxious, helpless, at the mercy of the greed and unpredictability of others. But Caesar did not behave that way. The pirates, according to what has been handed down, set a ransom for him. Caesar heard the amount and almost found it too low. He told them they clearly did not understand who they had captured and proposed that they raise the ransom higher. Even on the surface, the story carries an odd quality that is almost comic. A hostage bargaining to increase the price of his own ransom sounds like something that could happen only on a stage where all roles have been reversed. But if we stop merely at calling it cool or arrogant, we miss something far more important. What is striking is not simply that Caesar was bold. What is striking is that he seems to have refused to let the circumstance define his position. An ordinary person, once captured, begins to think from the lowest point: how to survive, how to plead, how to wait to be rescued. Caesar was different. He behaved as though he still retained the right to determine his own value, as though even in captivity he still had the authority to correct the way others saw him. That is not merely confidence. It is something closer to a deep instinct for dominance, an instinct that refuses to let the stage belong entirely to someone else. During the days he was held at sea, Caesar is said to have lived among the pirates with a very strange kind of bearing. He read poetry to them. He gave speeches. When they failed to show enough attention or did not fully appreciate the value of what he was saying, he scolded them as though they were the inferior ones. When he wished to rest, he ordered them to be quieter so that he could sleep. That is not the behavior of a trembling victim paralyzed by fear. Nor is it simply mad recklessness. It resembles more the conduct of a man whose inner axis was so strong that outward circumstances could not easily turn it. Here, Caesar's psychology begins to appear in a very particular color. There are those who want power because they fear their own smallness. There are those who want admiration because inside them is the emptiness of insecurity. But in Caesar, we see a different kind. He behaved as though power was, before anything else, a condition of the mind. It did not wait until he held office to begin. It did not require the seal of the Senate or the shouts of soldiers in order to appear. It lived already in the way a man entered a room, in the way he spoke, in the way he refused to let fear govern his posture. That is why this pirate story, in a DSP-style script, should not be told merely as an extraordinary anecdote for dramatic pleasure. It is a very early sign, a remarkably early one, of a man who would later impose his own rhythm upon those around him again and again. Even while captured, he still turned himself into the psychological center of the space. The men holding him thought they possessed his body, yet at least in the story that has come down to us, the commanding presence still seems to tilt toward Caesar. And then, as though all this were not enough, he even told the pirates that once he was released, he would return, capture them, and deal with them. They laughed. Perhaps they thought the young man was only speaking boldly to conceal his fear. The sea had long been accustomed to hearing empty threats. Men who live by violence often believe they understand human weakness very well. But Caesar, once again, did not speak like a man begging to live. He spoke like a man making note of something that would need to be finished. When the ransom was paid, and he was set free. The story might have ended there as a bitter memory best forgotten, but Caesar did not allow it to drift away like a mere accident at sea. He immediately gathered forces, pursued the pirates, captured them, and then truly dealt with them exactly as he had foretold. That action may make many people shudder at its coldness, but it also reveals a consistent trait in Caesar. He did not like the world to believe that his words were only sounds blown away by the wind. For him, Speech and action had to be tied together, as an anchor is tied to the side of a ship. A word once spoken had to carry the weight of being fulfilled. Perhaps from very early on, he had already understood that authority does not lie only in giving orders. It lies in teaching others that his words carry real consequences. So the anecdote at sea does not speak only of courage. It speaks of the unity between self-awareness, language, and action. It speaks of a man who, even before holding official power, already lived as though he belonged to a stature greater than his present circumstances. That was both his magnetism and the seed of danger. People like that are rarely content simply to live as ordinary men among the crowd. They want the world to react to their presence. The surface of the sea eventually grew calm. The sound of oars, the rough laughter of pirates, and the smell of salt clinging to cloth all drifted slowly into the past. But there are journeys that do not end when the ship reaches shore. They leave behind in a person a sharper edge in the gaze, a firmer faith in the weight of his own being. And from here, with the waves now behind him, Caesar moved toward another kind of power. No longer the power of boldness in danger, but the kind that could touch the imagination of men through words, through cadence, through the resonance of a voice sharpened enough to go before the sword. There are men who move toward power by the sword. There are men who move by wealth, by family standing, by closed doors where power is exchanged like a finely crafted commodity. But there are also those who understand very early that before one can direct the steps of the crowd, one must first touch something more invisible, their imagination. Julius Caesar, after years of brushing against danger, against the streets, against fear, and even against defiance upon the sea, seems to have stepped more deeply into that lesson when he came to Rhodes. At that time, Rhodes was not merely an island in the Mediterranean. It was a place where speech was sharpened like thin steel, where the art of rhetoric was not simply the art of speaking well, but a form of power. There, one learned how to arrange thoughts so that they entered another person's ear like water flowing through its proper channel. How to make a sentence not only correct, but rhythmic. How to keep an argument from becoming dry, like gravel, and instead give it warmth, imagery, and the power to move the heart. For a man like Caesar, this was not a matter of ornamenting his talent. It was a preparation of foundational importance. He sought out Apollonius Molon, a renowned master of rhetoric, a man who did not teach his students merely so that they might speak more, but so that they might speak more precisely, more forcefully, with more soul. This is worth reflecting upon, for Caesar was not the kind of man who lacked confidence or presence. He already possessed a natural quality that made others take notice. But natural charisma, however precious, is still a kind of wildfire. It may flare up beautifully, but if it is not guided, it cannot warm an entire age. Rhodes was perhaps the place where Caesar learned how to set that flame inside a lamp, so that his light would not merely flash and vanish, but burn long and burn in the right direction. We may imagine those days of study as quiet ones. No marching troops, no banners, no cheering crowds. Only a young man carrying great ambition, learning how to steady his breath, strike the right rhythm, choose the right word, and understand that in politics, an idea not spoken in the proper way is often no better than an arrow that never leaves the bowstring. The Romans respected strength, but they also lived within a culture where speech could save a career, stir a movement, redirect a session, or push an opponent into a defensive corner without the need to draw a sword. And Caesar, very likely, understood something deeper still. Whoever commands language commands the way others imagine reality. This is a hinge point in the process of his becoming himself. For victory, if it is not retold, is only an event that has passed. Reform, if it is not wrapped in language persuasive enough, is merely a change that will easily be resisted. Even ambition, if it does not know how to write its own story, is only a crude desire. Caesar seems to have realized on early that enduring power is not only the ability to do great things, but also the ability to turn those great things into a story that others want to believe, want to repeat, even want to belong to. Rhodes, then, did not merely teach him how to speak. It taught him something far greater, how to turn action into myth. Later, when Caesar wrote about the Gallic Wars in a style that was compact yet luminous, outwardly objective yet inwardly full of guiding force, we can clearly see the mark of this lesson. He did not merely win battles. He knew how to narrate his victories in such a way that they appeared almost inevitable. He did not merely appear in history. He knew how to stage his own image within history. This was not a mere falsehood. It was a form of political creation, shaping reality into meaning. To an audience today, that sounds both familiar and unsettling. For in every age, those who control the narrative hold a part of the crowd's soul. They do not need to force everyone. They need only make enough people feel that the story they tell is the main current of the age. Caesar was learning precisely this from very early on. Before he could order legions to march, he had to learn how to make men willingly step into the rhythm he had first built in their minds. But here, a certain subtlety is needed. Caesar was not merely a man who learned to speak in order to manipulate. To understand him that way would make him smaller than he was. The greater truth is that he understood speech as a tool of the will to organize the world. There are people who see life as scattered fragments. They speak in fragments as well. There are others, rarer ones, who carry in their minds an almost architectural instinct. They wish to arrange things anew, to fit events into a logic, to turn chaos into order. Such a man, when he studies rhetoric, does not learn merely in order to persuade. He learns in order to give the world the shape he wants it to have. Rhodes, with its sea wind and sunlight, with its chambers where each word was weighed with care, must have left a lasting mark upon Caesar. From this point on, he was no longer merely a young man with courage, ambition, and a bearing that circumstances could not easily swallow. He was beginning to become someone who understood that he himself could also be fashioned like a political work of art, not through cheap artificiality, but through the unity of image, action, and speech. And that was the moment Caesar came closer to a new kind of danger. For a man who possesses will, endurance, the ability to impose his presence, and who also knows how to use language to shape collective emotion, that man will sooner or later become an irresistible force in public life. He will not merely act. He will make his actions resonate longer than they naturally would. He will not merely walk. He will leave a sound behind each of his footsteps. But sometimes, before a person truly enters the great orbit of his life, fate places a mirror before him. Not so that he may admire himself, but so that his heart may suddenly ache at the distance between what he is and what he feels he ought to become. And there would be such a moment, quiet yet deep, when Caesar stood before a figure from the past, and for the first time realized that ambition, from that point onward, was no longer a passing thought, but a call that could no longer sleep. There are moments that redirect an entire human life, which from the outside seemed to contain almost nothing dramatic. No clash of swords, no city gates collapsing, no armies setting themselves in motion beneath a dim morning sky. Only a person standing still before some image and suddenly feeling a deep fissure open within the chest, so deep that from that point onward they can no longer live as they once did. For Julius Caesar, one such moment seems to have come when he stood before a statue of Alexander the Great. Later generations say that Caesar wept, a very brief detail, yet a haunting one. Those tears did not fall because of loss, did not fall because of fear, and did not fall because of weakness. They fell from a far more hidden place, the shame a man feels before his own potential when confronted with the life of another. At that time, Caesar still stood on the near side of great glory. He had presence, he had experience, he had tasted danger, and he had learned how to use language as a subtle instrument. But all of that was still not enough to turn him into the name before which history itself would bow its head to listen. And then before him stood Alexander, the Macedonian king who had conquered a vast part of the world while still very young, who had moved across the old maps like a storm, who had lived quickly, burned fiercely, and left behind a wound in history that could never be erased. Perhaps it was precisely that contrast that made Caesar's heart ache. Not because he envied in some petty way, but because he recognized something more frightening, that there are people born into the same human world, breathing the same air, bearing the same mortal limits of the body, and yet they live as though they can force an entire age to change its shape. And if that is possible for one human being, then the question immediately turns inward like the point of a blade. What about me? This is a very quiet kind of pain. It is not like the sadness of a man defeated after a lost battle. It is closer to the feeling of someone who suddenly sees the distance between what he is and what he feels he ought to become. Some people, when faced with that distance, turn away. They comfort themselves by saying that every life has its own rhythm, that peace is enough, that not everyone needs to leave a mark upon stone. But there are some people who cannot sleep peacefully after such a moment. For once they have seen the larger shadow of themselves waiting somewhere in the distance, ordinary life begins to taste like abandonment. Perhaps those tears before Alexander tell us more about Caesar than dozens of later victories. They show that he did not merely desire success. The man who desires success simply wants to be richer, higher, and more famous. But in this moment, Caesar appears as a man tormented by a question bound up with destiny. Am I living beneath the level I was born to reach? That is the moment when ambition ceases to be a beautiful thought one enjoys in the privacy of the mind. It becomes a debt that must be paid. Before this, Caesar may already have wanted to rise, to advance, to stand above others. But after this moment, perhaps he began to feel that he had to do something great enough, or else he himself would become the first person unable to forgive himself. This also reveals a very particular trait in Caesar's psychology. There are people who act only when pushed by circumstance. There are others who act when called forward by reward. But Caesar seems to belong to a third kind. He acted because he could not bear the thought that his life might pass without leaving some incision upon the fabric of history. Within him was a hunger not wholly belonging to wealth or pleasure. It was closer to a hunger for meaning on a grand scale. And from here, we also see more clearly the difference between Caesar and many other powerful men. He did not seek power merely in order to enjoy it. He wanted power as a means of turning himself into a being who could not be forgotten. In other words, Caesar did not fear failure alone. He feared the mediocrity of an unfinished life. That fear, in a certain sense, was both beautiful and dangerous. Beautiful because it can drive a person beyond familiar limits. Dangerous because once a man believes he was born to imprint himself upon history, he can very easily begin to regard every obstacle before him as something that must simply be swept aside. For today's audience, especially in an age where so many people live amid too much noise, too many comparisons, too much pressure to succeed, this moment in Caesar's life opens a gentler reflection. Not everyone needs to conquer the world. Not everyone must become Alexander or Caesar. But nearly all of us have had at least one quiet moment when looking at someone else or looking back upon our own life, we ask ourselves, have I truly lived out the full measure of the strength I was given? That question, if taken too far, can make us restless, but if held in a softer light, it can also awaken a person from a long sleep. For Caesar, that awakening did not come gently like advice. It was sharp, like a thin blade. From that point onward, he no longer seems to have walked as a man merely trying his luck in politics. He began to walk like someone carrying within himself a secret command. Every door of power that appeared before him was no longer merely an opportunity. It was a test. Every year that passed was no longer merely time. It was a question. Every man standing higher than he was no longer merely a rival. They were a reminder that life is short, and history does not hold its place for long for those who hesitate too long before their own destiny. Perhaps from that moment, a cord was drawn tighter inside Caesar, between talent and longing, between will and urgency, between his present self and the greater figure he wished to pursue. And once such a cord has been pulled taut, life rarely allows a person to go on living slowly and carelessly. He begins to need position, light, authority, a place high enough for ambition to assume an official form, for a great dream, if left too long in darkness, sooner or later becomes a fever of the soul. And Caesar, after those quiet tears, would no longer be content merely to carry ambition as a hidden flame within his chest. He began to seek for it a more public altar, where gods, the crowd, glory, and the debt of earthly life might meet beneath the same vaulted roof of power. There are steps to a power built of stone. There are steps built of blood. But there are also steps built of a softer material, one harder to see, and for that very reason, sometimes more enduring than walls themselves: legitimacy. Julius Caesar, after passing through the early collisions of ambition, seems to have understood very early that in Rome, if a man wished to stand high for long, he could not rely only on boldness, rhetorical skill, or the light of his lineage. He also had to find a way to step into that strange intersection between man and the gods, between political life and the sacred symbols before which the whole city had long been accustomed to bow for generations. That is why the office of Pontifex Maximus meant far more than its outward appearance suggested. At first hearing, it may sound like a religious office, a position bound to ritual, temples, sacrifices, auspicious days, and the spiritual order of the city of Rome. But to a mind that understands politics, this was not merely about the divine. It was one of the bridges that crossed the trust of the public. The man who held that office did not merely stand closer to the gods in ceremony. He stood closer to what the Romans called rightness. that sense of being aligned with a higher order shared by both the state and the community. And Caesar wanted that office, not in a casual way, not because he fancied a priestly robe or the honor of ritual. He wanted it because he understood that power lies not only in commanding others to act. Power also lies in making others feel that one's presence is something almost natural, almost rightful, almost preordained within the structure of the world. A man who has only money may be envied. A man who has only an army may be feared. But a man surrounded by the aura of legitimacy is far harder to cast down, because then opposing him no longer seems merely like opposing an individual, but almost like opposing the familiar rhythm of the city itself. Caesar, once again, showed that he was not merely a pursuer of victories. He was an architect of power. He understood that in public life, the light that falls upon a man's head can matter no less than the sword in his hand. But to purchase that light, he had to pay in something very earthly: money. And not merely money he already possessed, but borrowed money, enormous debts, financial wagers heavy enough to make other men hesitate. The contest for the office of Pontifex Maximus was not a gentle procession beneath the temple roof. It was a full-force struggle in which Caesar placed nearly his entire future upon the table. That detail makes his portrait all the more interesting. For here we see a man willing to borrow from the present in order to buy a place in the future. It is a very modern kind of thinking, one that feels close to leaders or founders in any age, accepting short-term risk in order to secure long-term influence. But in Caesar, it was not dry like calculation. It was almost a kind of faith. He seems to have believed that some doors, once opened, would make every debt that came before them a price worth bearing. We may imagine his state of mind in that period, bright with ambition, yet stretched taut by pressure. For debt is not merely a matter of numbers. It is a darkness that follows behind a man. The feeling that if he falls now, he will not only lose future glory, but be crushed by the very commitments he has already signed with the present. Many men in such a situation would step back and choose a safer road, one with less danger. But Caesar was not the kind of man who lived by safety. He lived by steps in which success might lift him very high, while failure could cause him to shatter on the spot. And in that high risk, we see another layer of his psychology more clearly. Caesar did not wait for power to come to him as a reward. He deliberately built the stage upon which power would have to appear around him. When he won the office of Pontifex Maximus, it was not merely an electoral victory. It was a turning point in the way he was seen. From that moment on, he was no longer only an ambitious nobleman or a sharp young politician. He became a man carrying a kind of ritual light within himself, a form of closeness to the gods and to the traditions of the city of Rome. And in a society that lived by symbols as Rome did, that was an immense political asset. But what is so remarkable about Caesar is this: he never wore only one robe. Beneath that sacred garment was still a man burdened with heavy debt, still forced to calculate, still forced to move with great skill through the currents of interest, influence, relationships, and expectation. In him, the sacred and the earthly were not separate. They twisted around one another like two cords pulling the chariot of power forward. And perhaps that, too, is one of the great secrets of politics in every age. The noblest symbols are often built out of the most ordinary materials. For today's audience, this part of Caesar's life suggests a memorable reflection. People often like to imagine that great power is built only from great ideals. But in truth, It is often constructed from a far more complicated mixture: belief, image, ritual, money, daring, and a sharp instinct for which door must be passed through at all costs. Caesar was not great because he was pure. He became great because he understood what the world is truly made of, and he was unafraid to step into the intersection between the exalted and the very low, between the light upon the temple and the debt records of ordinary life. From this point onward, his ambition no longer burned like a solitary flame in the dark. It now had support, a symbol, a position, and a kind of light that made many people look at him differently. But in Rome, no light was enough to lift a man to the summit if he still stood alone. That city functioned through a tangled web of money, military fame, public affection, and handshakes that did not belong entirely to trust. And Caesar, having stepped out from the shadow of the temple with a new aura upon his head, would soon understand that power is not a chair already prepared for genius to sit upon, but a net that must be woven from exactly the threads of one's own age. There are stages in a person's life when we still look at power as though it were a chair placed at the far end of the room. Whoever reaches it first sits down, and whoever is stronger keeps it longer. But then, if one looks a little more carefully, one begins to realize that power is rarely so simple. It is not merely a seat. It is a system of tangled, invisible, yet enduring cords, linking wealth to reputation, linking armies to the crowd, linking old hatreds to new handshakes. Julius Caesar, as he moved deeper into the political life of Rome, seems to have understood that very early, and that was the moment when he stopped merely dreaming of power. He began to design it. Rome at that time was a city of great names, but it was also a city of broken balances. Pompey possessed military radiance, carrying the prestige of successful campaigns and the dignity of a man whom all Rome had once looked up to. Crassus had money, and not merely money, but that softer kind of power born when a man can rescue, elevate, buy, or tilt another person's fate simply through wealth. And Caesar, at that moment, what did he have? He had talent, charm, a rising name, a very sharp instinct for the crowd, and a hunger so great that few could sit near him without feeling its heat. At a superficial glance, those three men seemed too different, ever truly to stand together. One carried the glow of victory. One carried the weight of wealth. One carried the vibrant ambition of the future. But it is precisely here that Caesar's formidable quality emerges. He did not view politics as a contest among isolated individuals. He saw it as the art of joining forces. He understood that a genius standing alone could still be strangled by the system. But if he knew how to connect his own strength to the other currents of energy moving through Rome, he could achieve something far greater. And so, what later generations would call the Triumvirate gradually took shape. This was not an alliance, beautiful, in any moral sense. It was not a meeting of kindred souls or of men united by some pure ideal. It was a structure of cold practicality, yet of great intelligence. Caesar understood what he himself needed from the other two. He needed the backing of wealth, the military glow of prestige already stamped upon the public imagination, a position strong enough that the conservative aristocracy could not crush him before he had fully begun. At the same time, he also understood what they needed from him: flexibility, mastery of the political arena, the ability to speak to the people, a man capable of connecting scattered fragments of power into a machine that could actually function. That is what makes this alliance memorable. It shows that Caesar was not merely a man who wanted to rule. He was a man who understood that to go far, one must know how to weave power. Perhaps this is one of the coldest yet truest lessons of politics. Very few men rise high by pure talent alone. Public life rarely rewards excellence in any innocent way. It demands alliance, bargaining, patience in closed rooms, and the ability to recognize another person's value even when one does not truly admire him. Caesar was never naive about that. He did not stand outside the web of power lamenting its unfairness. He entered it, touched each strand, and learned how to pull them in the direction that favored him. When he became consul, that was not merely the victory of a gifted individual. It was the result of a network stretched into place at the right moment. Caesar began to show Rome that he could do more than speak well or attract attention. He could turn different sources of power into a common structure. He could make the wealth of Crassus, the prestige of Pompey, and the support of the people cease to be three separate streams, and instead flow into the same river. Here again, Caesar's psychology reveals another very clear trait. Many men want to stand at the summit because they love the feeling of height. Caesar seems to have wanted to stand at the summit because from there he could arrange the entire landscape below. He did not merely enjoy winning step by step. He liked to create a new game board, one whose rules were more favorable to him. This is a profound difference between an opportunist and a man with an architectural instinct for power. The opportunist takes advantage of circumstance. Caesar, even at this stage, had already begun to create the shape of circumstance itself. Of course, such a network is never entirely stable. Alliances built on interest always carry within them the seeds of fracture. Each man enters them with his own calculations, his own pride, his own limit of patience. But Caesar seems to have accepted that as an inevitable part of life within power. He did not need structures that were morally perfect. He needed structures strong enough to drive him forward. For today's audience, this may stir both admiration and caution. For in Caesar, we see a rare political intelligence. He understood that modern power, in any age, rarely lies entirely in the hands of one man or one office. It lies in the ability to connect centers of influence to one another, to make each side believe it is gaining something, while the true coordinator is the one standing at the center of those threads. That is why the Triumvirate was not merely a political arrangement. It was a window through which we can see how Caesar thought, not linearly, not simply, not naively, but like a man looking at the map from above and asking which roads must be connected so that all Rome would gradually move in the direction he desired. From this point on, Caesar was no longer merely a noticeable figure among the Roman aristocracy. He was beginning to become a force with form, position, and structure. But a web of power, once woven, still needs a place where its true strength can be tested. Prestige in the Senate, alliances in the city, the applause of the public, all of it must eventually pass through a greater furnace, where a man is no longer measured by promises or relationships, but by his ability to lead others through mud, cold, blood, and distance. And to the north, beyond the horizon of Rome, there was waiting for him a land vast enough to turn a statesman into a legend, and dark enough as well to show the world the price a human being must pay whenever a genius decides to widen the borders of history. There are lands which, when a man steps into them, do not merely change the fate of that land, but also reveal the largest and most frightening version of the man himself. For Julius Caesar, Gaul was such a place. Before that, he already had ambition, a network, and a reputation steadily growing in the heart of Rome. But all of those things still resembled the first sketches upon a wide canvas. Only when he entered Gaul did the brush truly dip into a darker color. Only there did Caesar begin to appear no longer as a promising statesman, but as a historical force capable of bending the direction of the map itself. Gaul, in the imagination of many Romans, was a vast and distant land, full of tribes, deep forests, cold skies, and many things that had not yet submitted to the order of Rome. For Caesar, it was not merely a battlefield. It was an immense opportunity, a field wide enough for him to accumulate victories, enrich the state, enrich his soldiers, increase his own renown, and, most important of all, forge an almost lifeblood bond between himself and the legions. For there was a truth Caesar understood very clearly. In Rome, words could raise a man, but military achievement was what made a name heavy as stone. A statesman might be welcomed today and forgotten tomorrow, but a commander who led his soldiers through winter, through mud, through hunger, through wooden barriers, through blood and rain, and then returned with victory, that man would be remembered in an entirely different way. Caesar entered Gaul with that instinct, and he did not fail to seize it. Here, his military talent began to appear on a scale that few could deny. He moved quickly. He observed sharply. He understood that war was not merely strength colliding with strength, but rhythm, psychology, logistics, the ability to turn terrain, weather, distance, and fear into instruments of his own design. He could strike before the enemy had time to steady itself. He could retreat when necessary, without losing authority. He could divide forces that seemed united. He could make his soldiers, even in the harshest days, still feel that they were being led by a man who knew exactly where he was going. And it was precisely at this point that Caesar became more than a commander. He became the center of meaning for his army. The soldiers did not fight only for Rome in some abstract sense. They fought for the man who shared the cold, crossed the long roads with them, and turned hardship into common glory. In the Gallic War, Caesar did not merely conquer land. He also conquered the loyalty of the men who would later become his greatest support. But if we stop there, the story becomes too easy, too bright, and too far from the truth. For every military legend, when examined closely, has its shadowed side. The radiance of victory often shines so powerfully toward the victor that people easily forget to look down at the ground where darkness has been left behind. Gaul was where Caesar became a legend, yes. But it was also there that the fields fell silent in a way Rome did not always wish to hear fully told. Behind the concise reports, the lucid pages, the victories recorded with an almost inevitable rhythm, there were tribes shattered, communities torn away from the old pattern of life, people who died and whose names were never written down with the same solemnity as the names of generals. There were villages where cooking smoke no longer rose. There were forests where the familiar calls of an old language were no longer heard. There were lands that from then onward would live under another order, speak another tongue, worship other symbols, and gradually forget the original shape of themselves. This is what makes the story of Caesar in Gaul both compelling and something that causes one to pause for a while in silence, for he was not a blindly destructive man. He had purpose, strategy, and remarkable organizational power. But history is often not cruel in the manner of chaotic rage. It is cruel through efficiency. And Caesar was a man so efficient that the human cost often became all the colder because of it. Perhaps this is the moment when the audience begins to feel something more clearly. Caesar was not only radiant, he was also a storm. And a storm, however beautiful it may appear from afar, always leaves behind torn roofs and broken trees and stretches of ground that are no longer what they once were. What must also be said is that Caesar seems to have understood very well the importance of telling that story. He wrote about the Gallic War in a restrained, lucid style, sparing in emotional display, as though everything were simply being recorded objectively. Yet it is precisely that clarity and restraint that create a special power. They make his victories appear reasonable, almost unavoidable. This is a rare talent, not only to create events, but also to frame the way later generations will see those events. Caesar did not allow his victories to drift freely in the memory of others. He held them, placed them into narrative, and in doing so, turned war into the stone foundation of his own image. Rome looked toward Gaul and saw wealth, land, glory, security at the frontier, and a general growing greater and greater. But on a deeper level, Gaul was also changing the balance of the Republic itself. Every victory Caesar won in the north did not merely enlarge the world of Rome. It also made one individual too large for the old political framework. The army was becoming increasingly attached to him. The people were hearing his name in a different tone. His rivals in Rome were beginning to understand that they were no longer facing an ambitious politician, but a man who now held the most dangerous thing of all, armed glory. And so, Gaul was not merely a conquest. It was the furnace in which Caesar was forged from common metal into an alloy of legend, discipline, speed, prestige, and fear. But every furnace eventually reaches the moment when the full heat of what it has created must be tested. There would come a battle in which his military genius would no longer be spread across many years and many campaigns, but forced to gather itself into a narrower, tenser, more suffocating space, where walls would be built not only to encircle others, but also to prove that there are some men who, when driven to the edge, look upon the battlefield as a board that can be arranged anew from the very beginning. There are battles that do not merely decide who wins and who loses, but also reveal the way a person sees the world. For many, the battlefield is a place where dust rises, where cries surge in waves, where iron and fear clash in confusion. But for Julius Caesar, in certain rare moments, the battlefield seems also to have been a living map, a place where space itself could be bent, where rhythm could be altered, and where despair, if grasped at the right point, could become the highest form of discipline. Alesia was such a moment. That battle took place when the fire of resistance in Gaul had gathered itself beneath the name of Vercingetorix. These were no longer scattered skirmishes among dispersed tribes, but a great effort to gather together the dignity, land, and freedom that were gradually slipping from their hands. Vercingetorix withdrew into the stronghold of Alesia, a high position with defensive advantage, as though he wished to make the terrain itself his final ally. Hilltop fortress, a force holding out within and outside it, Caesar with his legions. On the surface, it might have seemed like a familiar siege, but Alesia would not remain in history as merely a siege. What made this battle different was that Caesar did not merely have to keep those inside the fortress trapped. He also knew very well that from the outside, a Gallic relief force would sooner or later arrive. In other words, he did not stand before a single enemy. He was placing himself between two jaws. Before him, the enemy under siege. Behind him, the enemy coming to lift it. For many men, that would have been a situation demanding hesitation, delay, and reliance on chance. But Caesar was not a man who lived by vague hope. He responded in a way deeply characteristic of himself. When threatened by space, he rearranged space itself. And so, the walls began to rise. Not only one ring, but two. One facing inward to tighten around Alesia, one facing outward to block the relief army. Deep ditches, barricades, sharpened stakes, hidden traps, camps, supply routes, rhythms of watchfulness. All of it was built not in panicked reaction, but as though Caesar were redrawing the earth itself with his will. That is what makes Alesia a symbol of his military genius. He did not accept the terrain as something given. He behaved as though the entire landscape before him could still be altered to serve his thought. Let us pause for a moment and feel the strangeness of that. There are men who are strong because they know how to attack. There are men who are strong because they know how to endure. But at Alesia, Caesar showed another kind of strength. He was strong because he turned the very conditions of the conflict into something he could control. That was not merely military technique. It was a deeper kind of intelligence of power. When pressed into difficulty, do not ask only how to resist. Ask whether the entire board can be arranged anew. Of course, those walls were not raised in peace. Behind every stretch of fortification were sweat, bloodied hands, sleepless nights, and soldiers who understood that they were digging not only to win, but to survive. Inside Alesia, food was growing scarce. Outside, the Gallic relief force approached like another wave. Then the inevitable moment came. The Romans were pressed by force from both sides at once, those inside seeking to break out, those outside seeking to break in. At such a moment, an encirclement no longer remained merely a symbol of control. It could become the trap that imprisoned its own maker. It is precisely here that the difference between a good general and a man whose nerves are made of something harder than ordinary begins to appear. Caesar did not allow himself to be swallowed by the panic of the moment. Under pressure from both ends, he still retained the ability to see the whole. He shifted forces, reinforced where lines were weak, appeared in person where morale trembled, and where confidence was needed, gave it through the force of his own presence. In many battles, victory belongs not only to the side with the better plan, but to the side that preserves inner order longer once chaos begins to flood in. At Alesia, Caesar showed that he possessed that order. Perhaps that is why so many of his soldiers followed him not only through discipline, but through a trust that was almost personal. They knew that this man did not see war as a storm of dust without direction. He always tried to find the structure hidden beneath the chaos, and when soldiers believe that their commander can see what they themselves cannot, they endure more, stand longer, and hold formation where others would already have broken. In the end, Alesia fell. Vercingetorix surrendered. The image of the Gallic leader giving himself up to Caesar entered historical memory like a deep fold. Within it were honor, sorrow, and the closing of a great effort to preserve a world that was being lost. And for Caesar, Alesia was not merely a great victory. It was public proof that he was not simply a successful general, favored by circumstance or courage. He was a man able to look at the battlefield from the height of thought, as a chess player looks upon the pieces not only where they stand now, but where they will be forced to move next. But like every other summit in Caesar's life, this victory did not shine only with light. It also cast a very long shadow back toward Rome. After Alesia, He was no longer merely a commander carrying out his duty on the frontier. He had become a man too large for that city to look upon his return with ease. The fortifications in Gaul had not only closed around the enemy, they had also invisibly closed off an entire phase of the Republic in which personal ambition was still held within familiar limits. From here onward, the road home was no longer merely a geographical road. It was the road that would bring a man carrying too much glory, too many loyal armies, too much awareness of himself, back into confrontation with a Rome aging within its old mechanisms. And the time would come when, instead of building rings of earth and timber around a distant fortress, Caesar would stand before a boundary far smaller in form, a river not wide, not violent, perhaps even trivial on the map, but far deeper in meaning. For there are waters that do not halt a man by their breadth, but by the price fate demands when one decides to cross them. There are moments in history that, on the surface, appear so small as to seem almost insignificant. Not a great flood, not a mountain collapsing, not a city burning for many days beneath a red sky. Only a narrow river, its water flowing quietly, its banks low, its name perhaps startling no one if placed among countless vast maps. And yet that very small place becomes the dividing line between two ages, between a man and the former version of himself, between the familiar order of the world and the new shape the world will be forced to take afterward. The Rubicon was such a place. After his years in Gaul, Julius Caesar was no longer the statesman who had once needed to build networks in order to rise. He had become a man carrying in his hands the most dangerous thing in an aging republic: armed glory and an army that not only obeyed him, but believed in him. From a distance, those victories filled Rome with pride. But as Caesar drew closer and closer to Italy, bringing with him a fame too great to fit within the old frame of the Republic, that pride began to change color. In the minds of the aristocracy, in those corridors where men spoke calmly but thought with hidden anxiety, one question grew ever larger. What would happen if this man returned and refused to make himself smaller? The Rubicon, then, was not merely a geographical boundary. It was a legal, symbolic, and psychological line. According to Roman order, a governor was not permitted to lead troops across that boundary into Italy. To do so was no longer the act of a commander completing his duty. It became a gesture of defiance against the Republic itself. From that moment onward, the army no longer stood outside domestic political life. The sword no longer pointed only beyond the frontier. It stepped into the center of the very house that had given birth to it. And Caesar came to the bank of that river. We may imagine that night as just cold enough for a man to draw his cloak a little closer. The water made no loud sound. The sky offered no instruction. No god appeared in the clouds to declare clearly which choice was right. The greatest decisions of human life are perhaps always like that. In the end, they occur within a silence that no one else can fully share, where reason, ambition, fear, memory, and the sense of destiny all stand crowded together within the same chest. At that moment, Caesar surely did not see only a stream of water. Behind him, he saw all that he had built: military achievement, the loyalty of his soldiers, prestige, and also the clear awareness that if he laid down his arms and returned as an ordinary citizen, he could be crushed by his enemies through the very laws they claimed to defend against him. But before him as well, there was no brightly lit road. To cross the Rubicon was not simply to travel a little farther. It was to acknowledge that from this point on, history would judge him by a different standard. Perhaps it is precisely here that Caesar's true tragedy appears, for it is very possible that he did not see himself merely as a man betraying the Republic out of naked ambition. More likely, in his own mind, there remained a sincere part that believed Rome had grown rotten, that the old system was no longer wide enough for the vitality of a new age, that those who claimed to defend tradition were in truth only protecting worn-out privilege, and that if he did not move forward, he himself would be destroyed, not because he had sinned against Rome, but because he had become too large for those who wanted Rome to remain as small as they could control. In that sense, Caesar may have believed that he was saving Rome from its own aging, but the tragedy lies here. Even when a man believes he is saving an order, he may at the same time be the one tearing it open. That is what the Rubicon was, a single act capable of wearing two faces at once. For Caesar, it was an assertion of the right to defend himself, the step of a man refusing to let his achievements be devoured by political hostility. But for the Republic, it was the most terrible incision of all. From this point onward, the law no longer stood above everything. One individual, with an army behind him, had crossed over and declared that his own weight was greater than the old boundary. This is precisely why the Rubicon lives forever in human memory, not because it was a great river, but because it is the perfect image of those invisible boundaries in political and moral life. There are limits whose fragility is understood only once they have been crossed. There are institutions that seem as durable as stone, yet before an individual is sufficiently great, they are revealed to be more like worn cloth that tears quickly once pulled hard enough. And then Caesar crossed. That moment, though later wrapped in famous lines and layers of historical legend, still carries something deeply human. Not the humanity of smallness, but the humanity of a man who knows full well that he is pushing open a door which, once opened, will never close again in quite the same way. After that step, he was no longer the victorious general from the north. He became a force, moving into the heart of Rome with all the light and darkness he carried within him. From that point on, everything moved more quickly. Old loyalties were put to the fire. Reputations that had once stood side by side began to confront one another. Men who had once been allies or counterweights were now forced to choose their positions within a great unraveling. The Republic, long cracked already, could no longer hide its fractures. Now they appeared beneath the footsteps of a man who had accepted becoming the blade that would cut straight through that old fabric. For later generations, the Rubicon has always suggested a quiet lesson. Not every turning point comes in a colossal form. Sometimes, what decides an entire age is only a moment that, from the outside, appears smaller than a thought. But its depth is far greater, because from such a decision, not only does one man's fate change, the entire language of power, of law, of loyalty, and of fear begins to learn how to speak in a new voice. The river was now behind him, but water, once stirred, does not quickly grow still again. Ahead of Caesar, there was no longer a border, but a road leading into civil war, where the great names of Rome would no longer stand together beneath a shared political sky, but would be forced to discover who could survive once the old order had begun to collapse, like a roof whose beams had cracked. And amid those ruins, another trait in Caesar's portrait would come into view. He not only knew how to defeat his enemies, but also how to keep them alive beneath the shadow of the new order he was building. There are civil wars sadder than any war against outsiders. When a city fights a distant enemy, it can at least still believe that it is resisting something foreign to itself. But when swords turn toward names that once stood beneath the same sky, that once shared the same political language, the same memory of the Republic, the same Roman pride, then every victory carries bitterness with it. After crossing the Rubicon, Julius Caesar was no longer moving through the space of frontier conquest. He had entered the most painful region of Roman history, the place where the enemy was no longer some distant tribe, but the very faces that had once formed the skeleton of the Republic. And among those faces, Pompey was the greatest name of all. Pompey was not some insignificant man swept onto the battlefield merely to serve as a backdrop for Caesar's brilliance. He was a man who possessed glory of his own, who had long been known in Rome as a celebrated general, who had once stood high, beneath a kind of light the crowd understood and respected. And so, when Caesar and Pompey moved steadily toward their unavoidable confrontation, this was not simply a war between two individuals. It was more like the collision of two different visions of power, two great trajectories born from the heart of the Republic, but no longer able to coexist within the same space. In those days, Rome trembled not only from fear of war, it trembled from the feeling that the old order was beginning to break itself apart. The halls that had once echoed with debate were now replaced by marching footsteps. Legal arguments now had to stand beside a far colder reality. Who had the army? Who had the speed? Who had the ability to force the age to move to his rhythm? The height of that confrontation appeared at Pharsalus. On that field, everything seemed compressed together. The pride of the aristocracy, the anxiety of the Republic, Caesar's ambition, Pompey's honor, the loyalty of soldiers, and the fate of a political order reaching the point beyond which it could never return whole. If one looks only with military eyes, Pharsalus is yet another victory of commanding genius. Caesar with fewer men, yet more agile, sharper, more perceptive of the psychology of the battlefield, and calm enough to turn weakness into opportunity. But if we stop there, we still have not touched the deepest point of this battle. What makes Pharsalus special is not only that Caesar won. What matters even more is what he did with that victory. Pompey was defeated and fled to Egypt, where he hoped he might find temporary refuge beneath the shadow of a court that still owed him political gratitude. But power is rarely faithful to memory. He was murdered before he could truly begin any new chapter of his fate. That death, on the surface, might seem to have relieved Caesar of a dangerous rival, but the truth is more subtle. When Pompey's head was presented as a gift, Caesar did not rejoice. Tradition says he was moved. For a man like Caesar, defeating a great rival in battle was one thing. Seeing a man who had once been a pillar of Rome murdered like an object, passed from hand to hand, was quite another. In that moment, civil war appeared no longer as a strategy, but as a tragedy. And from here, a very distinctive feature of Caesar's way of ruling begins to emerge more clearly: the policy of clemency. At first glance, clemency is always easy to tell as a beautiful virtue. A victor who knows how to forgive sounds noble, generous, and admirable. But in Caesar, that clemency did not belong only to morality. It was also a highly refined technique of power. He forgave many opponents, allowed many who had once stood on the other side to live, to return, even to continue taking part in political life. This was not a weakness, nor was it entirely unconditional kindness. Caesar understood a truth not every victor understands. Power is more enduring when it knows how to absorb its enemies, not merely destroy them. A man who is killed disappears, but sometimes becomes a memory that others can hate for generations. A man who is spared must face something far more difficult. He must continue to exist within the world the victor has built. He must breathe beneath the atmosphere of the new order. He must carry the moral debt of having been forgiven. And from that point onward, he becomes, almost invisibly, living proof of Caesar's power, a power that could not only strike down, but also embrace and dissolve the resistance of the defeated. This is what makes Caesar both great and unsettling, for he did not conquer only by the sword. He conquered by the ability to turn victory into a kind of psychological order. Others did not merely lose to him on the battlefield. They were compelled to go on living beneath his shadow. There is a certain elegant coldness in that. It spills less blood than mass slaughter, yet can in some ways go deeper. For it does not end the enemy. It redefines their place in the world. Of course, such clemency did not heal every wound at once. Civil war left behind too much suspicion, too many fractured honors, too many memories that could not easily be lulled to sleep. Those who were spared were not always grateful. Some felt indebted. Some felt quietly humiliated. Some accepted life and continued on. But deep within them, the fear of a Caesar grown too great continued to grow with the years. His policy of clemency, therefore, was both the glue of reconciliation and a mirror that made people see more clearly just how high he had risen above the rest of the Republic. For today's audience, this is perhaps one of the most thought-provoking parts of Caesar's life. Mature power lies not only in winning quickly or forcefully, it also lies in understanding that people are not ruled by violence alone. They are also ruled by gratitude, by debt, by shame, by being spared, and by the helplessness that comes from realizing the new order is already wide enough to swallow them whole. Caesar was a master of that kind of power, and for that reason, he was not merely the victor on the battlefield. He was the man who knew how to turn victory into a new environment in which all who survived would have to learn how to breathe. But a new order, whether built by the sword or by clemency, cannot stand firm if it stops at Italy alone. Caesar understood that. After Pharsalus, his road would not end with enemies who had fallen or been forgiven. It would carry him farther, to a city where light carried the fragrance of the East, where power lay not only in armies, but also in grain, symbols, dynasties, and in the gaze of a woman who understood politics no less than any general. There, amid palace and river, Caesar would meet another kind of power, softer on the surface, yet also as ancient and as sharp as any Roman blade. There are cities that enter history like a fortress. There are other cities that enter it like a dream. Alexandria seems to belong to the second kind. It was not merely a place. It was light reflected upon the sea, libraries and palaces, the scent of incense, the whisper of civilizations that had lived long enough to understand that power does not always need to wear armor in order to become frightening. When Julius Caesar set foot there, he was not simply traveling farther across the map. He was stepping into a world where power wore a different shape, softer on the surface, subtler in its expression, yet no less resolute. After the Civil War, after Pharsalus, after the victories that had made his name weigh more heavily in the heart of Rome, Caesar came to Egypt at a moment when everything was fragile. The Ptolemaic dynasty was sinking into dispute. Cleopatra and her brother had been drawn into an internal struggle for power. Egypt to Rome was not merely some strange eastern land of temples and desert. It was food. It was grain. It was the stability of a country whose descent into chaos would not stop at the banks of the Nile. A state growing as large as Rome could not remain indifferent to the other end of the world if that other end held in its hands part of its own breath. For that reason, the meeting between Caesar and Cleopatra should not be reduced to a romantic anecdote, even though later generations always like to remember history through beautiful and easily told details. Yes, there was the carpet, there was the dramatic entrance, there was an Alexandrian night dark enough to make every great negotiation look like a scene from a dream. But if we stop only at seduction, we make both of those people smaller than they were. What was taking place here was far greater. It was the meeting of two political intelligences, two people who both understood that beauty, presence, language, and ritual were only the outer layer of a much larger board. Cleopatra, at that time still very young, was by no means naive. She was not merely a queen appealing to a powerful Roman general for help. She was a woman who understood that a throne is not kept by bloodline alone, but by the ability to read the times and step into their very center. She knew what Egypt needed in order to survive. She knew what Rome needed from Egypt. And perhaps most importantly, she knew how to turn her own presence into an argument. There are people who speak in order to persuade. There are others who enter a room and whose very appearance is already part of the art of persuasion. Cleopatra seems to have belonged to the latter kind. As for Caesar, he surely saw in her more than a beautiful face or some exotic story from the East. He saw an ally who could help keep stable a crucial axis of the Mediterranean world. He saw the possibility of restoring order in Alexandria in a way favorable to Rome and to himself. But perhaps he also saw something else, something subtler. In the East, power did not stand only upon military victory. It lived in symbol, ritual, dynasty, grain, harbors, temples, ancient traditions, and in the art of making others feel that one's rule was almost part of the universe itself. If Rome had taught Caesar how power could be built through law, the Senate, legions, and the crowd, then Alexandria reminded him that power could also be woven through light, luxury, dynastic continuity, and the ability to command the imagination. The East did not always advance through the sound of nailed sandals. Often it came like fragrance in a closed chamber, not immediately visible, yet once it spread, it was present everywhere. The alliance between Caesar and Cleopatra, therefore, carried many more layers than people usually tell. It had personal attraction, certainly. It had a political necessity, clearly. But deeper than that, it was also a lesson in a truth that great rulers often have to learn. If one wishes to rule for long, it is not enough merely to know how to win battles. One must also know how to ally oneself with symbols, sources of life, cultural centers, and with those who can preserve stability where one's own sword cannot remain forever. Perhaps it was in Alexandria that the image of Caesar expanded once again. He was not merely the general from the West arriving with the strength of armies and victory. He appeared as a man flexible enough to enter another civilization without behaving like someone who knew only how to trample it. Of course, that did not make him gentle. Caesar remained Caesar, the man who always wished to shape reality according to his own rhythm. But here, we see that he understood a very important principle. There are places that cannot be held by fear alone. They must be held through the right kind of connection, through alliance, through allowing power to wear the form that the land itself can accept. And that is why this chapter of Caesar's life possesses its own beauty, while also inviting its own reflections. It shows that true power is not one-colored. It is not only the speed of marching armies, not only the hard dryness of command. It is also the ability to sit down in the midst of another world, to see the resources behind the silk curtains, to see geopolitics behind a glance, to see food behind a conversation, to see the stability of an entire sea in the survival of a single dynasty. For today's audience, this story still leaves a very clear resonance. In every age, people are often too quick to underestimate forms of power that are not especially loud. We are accustomed to fearing great noise, yet sometimes it is precisely the softer things, story, symbol, attraction, alliance, supply, psychology, that decide the long game. Alexandria taught Caesar, and teaches us as well, that enduring power does not lie only in the tightly clenched hand. Very often it also lies in the hand that knows how to open at the right moment in order to hold what cannot be, held by violence alone. But Caesar was not a man to remain long within any enchanting setting. However beautiful Alexandria might have been, however deeply his meeting with Cleopatra may have echoed, the deepest core of his nature continued to lean toward motion. He belonged to swift decisions, precise blows, those moments in which the world had not yet understood what had happened before reality had already been rearranged. And then, leaving behind the lights of the East, he would give history a sentence so brief that it was almost cold in its sharpness. A sentence that not only told of victory, but also revealed the heartbeat of the man himself. He came very quickly, saw very clearly, and acted so quickly that the age had to run behind him. There are some people who move through history like those who light lamps in the night, slow, steady, enduring. But there are also those who pass through it like a flash of lightning, not lingering too long at any single point, yet enough to make the whole sky change color after the instant of their appearance. Julius Caesar seems to have belonged to the second kind. In him, speed was not merely a habit of action, it was almost a way of seeing the world. And perhaps nowhere does that appear more clearly than in the famous short phrase that has crossed more than 2,000 years and still remains sharp as a newly honed blade. Veni, Vidi, Vici. I came, I saw, I conquered. That line is associated with Caesar's victory at Zela over Pharsalus II, the son of Mithridates. In scale, this was not the greatest battle of his life. It was not a storm that stretched across many years, as in Gaul. It was not a fateful turning point like the Rubicon, nor was it a civil war, confrontation that made the whole republic tremble, as Pharsalus did. But for that very reason, Zela becomes a particularly clear mirror of one special quality in Caesar. He did not merely know how to win. He knew how to win so quickly that the enemy had no time to stabilize the shape of its resistance. In many people, speed is the consequence of impatience. In Caesar, speed seems to have been the result of something else. The ability to perceive the structure of a situation almost instantly. He did not need to remain long in order to understand the board. He observed quickly, connected quickly, decided quickly, and then acted with a decisiveness so forceful that others were left with the feeling that their own time for reflection had been cut short. This was not simply a matter of fast hands or swift feet. It was a form of power over time itself, and that is precisely what made Caesar different. Most people live within time as rowers moving with the current. They react after events have already happened. They wait for more information. They hesitate before taking a risk. They delay in order to be more certain. Often, that is wisdom, but Caesar seems to have understood that in moments of chaos, the one who commands the tempo often commands the outcome as well. Whoever decides more quickly does not merely move one step ahead. He forces the rest of the world to move along the trajectory he has created. For that reason, Veni, Vidi, Vici should not be understood merely as a boast after victory. It is the condensation of an entire style of rule. I came, meaning I did not stand at a distance contemplating for too long. I saw, meaning I recognized the essence of the situation very quickly. I conquered, meaning there was very little space between my understanding and my action. In Caesar, that space was always frighteningly short, and that is exactly what made him such an irresistible force in both political and military life. Those who opposed him did not merely have to resist his army, or his rhetorical skill, or the radiance of his fame. They also had to resist the speed of his decision-making, a quality that constantly placed them in the position of arriving too late. In politics, arriving one beat late is sometimes only a disadvantage. But in war, arriving one beat late can mean losing everything. Yet to say that Caesar revered speed does not mean he was shallow. On the contrary, only those who have accumulated enough experience, enough instinct, enough ability to read people and read the balance of events can decide quickly without becoming wholly blind. Caesar's speed was not the haste of a man without depth. It was closer to the reflex of a sword that has been tempered for too long. When it cuts downward, it does not need to stop and ask itself what it is. What is worth reflecting on is that Caesar did not only march quickly or strike quickly. He also wrote quickly, communicated quickly, and defined events quickly. After the victory, he did not explain at length. He compressed everything into 3 short verbs, as though even language itself had to submit to his philosophy. He did not allow events to drag behind him in cumbersome explanations. He turned victory into a blinding flash, then fastened his name to it before others had time to tell it in another way. This is a very modern lesson in power. Whoever controls the speed of actions often controls the psychology of the opponent. But whoever controls even the speed of the story after the action goes farther still, that person controls the way the world will remember the event. Of course, speed also carries its price. A world pushed forward too quickly can become dizzy. Institutions, traditions, people, even loyalty itself. Not all of them can adapt in time to the pace of an extraordinary individual. What saved Caesar in many moments was speed, but that very quality also made him increasingly alien to the slowness by which aging republics protect themselves. Rome could admire such a man, even need such a man in times of disorder. But Rome also had reason to fear him, because not every structure can endure a person who lives as though time itself must compress in order to make way for him. For today's audience, in an age where everything moves faster, this story carries a very strange resonance. We often think of speed as a sign of efficiency, intelligence, and strength. And often it truly is. There are opportunities that live only for a few short breaths. There are crises that can be saved only by timely decisions. But Caesar also reminds us that speed, once it becomes the very nature of power, does not merely rescue the world from stagnation. It can also cause the structures around it to lose the chance to breathe. In him, speed was a weapon, a style, a strategic advantage, and also a kind of destiny. He lived like a man who always heard the clock of history running faster than others did. and so he did not delay. He did not allow things to settle for too long. He did not accept those intervals of waiting that he considered wasteful. He wanted reality to move according to the rhythm of his own will, and for many years, he succeeded in doing exactly that to a rare degree. But then, after all those times of arriving quickly, seeing quickly, and conquering quickly, a deeper question began to emerge. If a man can change the course of events through speed, can he do more than that? Can he not only overcome crises, but also rearrange time itself for an entire civilization? And from here, Caesar would step into another form of power, no longer merely the man who moved like lightning across the battlefield, but one who wished to reset the rhythm of the calendar, of the laws, of the land, of citizenship, and of the very machinery governing the Roman world. There are people who enter history to the sound of hoofbeats. There are others who enter it through laws, through quieter changes, less dazzling to the eye, yet more enduring in human life. Julius Caesar, after years of shaking frontiers and bending the political board of Rome, did not stop at the image of a conqueror. He also wanted to do something greater, harder, and more dangerous, to rearrange the world after he had broken it apart. This is the point at which Caesar rises beyond the familiar image of a general. Many men are very good at breaking things. Few are truly good at rebuilding them. War can open the way, but a new order cannot live on the radiance of victory alone. It must be supported by the calendar, by law, by land, by administration, by the feeling that the daily life of human beings has begun to move to a different rhythm. And Caesar understood that. Perhaps no achievement of his carries deeper symbolic weight than the Julian calendar. At first glance, it may seem to concern only dates, years long and short, the counting of time, so that the seasons do not drift away from the sky. But if we stop there, we miss its true beauty. For in a deeper sense, Caesar was not merely correcting a technical error. He was almost placing his hand upon the very breath of civilization itself. Before him, the Roman calendar had become confused, open to manipulation, and out of step with the natural cycle. By reforming that system, Caesar did not merely make the months and days more accurate. He compelled Rome to live according to a new order, clearer, steadier, and more closely aligned with the movement of heaven and earth. It is a powerful image. A man famous for swift decisions and lightning victories, now placing his hand upon the slowest and most all-encompassing thing of all time. He did not merely want to move faster than his age. He wanted to make the age itself run by a new clock. But Caesar's reforms did not end there. He also looked upon the machinery of the state and saw an entity that had grown cumbersome and fractured, with many of its parts living too long by old habits. After the Civil War, Rome did not need only a victor. Rome needed someone who could reorganize life itself. Caesar undertook many measures to restore administrative order, adjust the governance of the provinces, exert some control over the chaos of debt, resettle veterans through colonies, and extend citizenship to more communities within the Roman world as it expanded beyond the old core of the city of Rome. Taken one by one, these acts may sound like ordinary affairs of government, but when placed side by side, they reveal his broader vision. Caesar was not thinking merely as a man holding power for today. He was thinking as a man trying to give power a shape more enduring than himself. The granting of land to veterans, for example, was not simply payment for loyalty. It was a way of giving those who had fought for him a place within the new order, so that war would leave behind not only memories of blood and fire, but also points of civil stability. The adjustment of debt was not merely an attempt to please the crowd. It was an effort to ease a society that had been strained too long by inequality, instability, and the consequences of conflict. The expansion of citizenship was not merely an act of generosity. It reflected a larger intuition. Rome could not forever remain a city ruling the world with the closed mentality of a city. Here, Caesar appears as a man who understood very clearly a truth that many conquerors never learn. It is not enough to expand territory. One must also expand the structure of belonging. Otherwise, the empire is the only occupied land. But when law, rights, and political identity begin to be redistributed, then the conquered world slowly begins to turn into a new order. What makes these reforms memorable is not only their substance, but also their rhythm. Caesar still carried his essential nature within him. Swift, decisive, unwilling to sink too long into hesitation. But in this stage, his speed was no longer used only to win battles. It was used to shape reality. He corrected, arranged, added, shifted, and organized. It seems that for Caesar, a chaotic world was not something to lament. It was material waiting to be reordered by a will strong enough to do it. And it is precisely here that we begin to see a paradox in him that is both beautiful and sad. Caesar was great not only because of what he defeated, but also because of what he rebuilt. He was not only the storm that blew apart the old republic. He was also the man walking among those ruins with the ambition to raise up a new structure, more compact, more efficient, more fitting to the true scale of the Roman world. That makes him far more formidable than the image of a general who lived only through war. But that is also what made him more frightening. For when a man not only wins battles, but also begins arranging the calendar, the laws, the land, the citizens, and the administrative machine according to his own rhythm, then his power no longer lies on the battlefield alone. It enters deeper layers of life. It ceases to be merely influence. It becomes the very form of order. And at that point, those standing around him begin to feel a very particular anxiety. If this man continues, will there still be room in Rome for any center other than him? Perhaps this was the moment when Caesar came closest to the form of a founder, even though he never had time to wear the crown that so many later attached to his name. He had proven that he did not merely know how to break old limits. He also knew how to use power to compel time, law, and political space to move in a new rhythm. But the more he succeeded in doing that, the higher he rose above the rest of the republic. And in the world of politics, a man standing too high is not admired alone. He also begins to be seen as a shadow, spreading too quickly across the square. The reforms gradually settled upon paper, upon fields, upon the lives of ordinary people, like fine dust after a long day of building. But in a deeper place, another movement had already begun. For when a man grows large enough to rearrange time itself, those who live around him will sooner or later begin to ask whether they are still serving a state, or whether they are standing within the orbit of a single sun. And from within that light, fear silently begins to gather like darkness at the foot of a statue grown too tall. There are summits not covered in snow, but in solitude. From below, people see only the light, glory, power, awe, the ability to make an entire age change its rhythm to the footsteps of one man. But to stand too high for too long, a person will eventually feel something else. The wind grows colder. The distance from the ground becomes greater. The faces that once looked up in admiration sometimes begin to change expression without saying a word. And most frightening of all, when a man has become too great, then even his own shadow can begin to terrify others. Julius Caesar entered the final stage of his life in precisely that condition. After war, after reforms, after victories that had lifted him beyond the reach of most of his contemporaries, Rome no longer looked upon him as merely an outstanding statesman. He had become the center of the new order. Offices, ceremonies, honors, symbols, statues, seats, titles, all of them seemed to gather around him like metal drawn toward a magnet too strong to resist. And then came the title Dictator Perpetuo, Dictator for life. On the surface, this was only one more step in the power Caesar already held. But on a deeper level, it was an enormous signal. For the Roman Republic, though long fractured, still lived by a fundamental belief that supreme power, if it existed at all, must be temporary, must remain limited, must return to its frame once the crisis had passed. When Caesar accepted that title, many people likely no longer saw merely a man being honored. They saw a more frightening possibility. Rome might no longer remain the old Rome. This was not the groundless fear of men driven merely by envy. It was deeper than that. Throughout his life, Caesar had proven many times that he was not only good at winning, he was also good at reorganizing the world according to his own will. That made him great. But precisely for that reason, he began to create a feeling that republics find very hard to endure. The feeling that every road was beginning to lead toward one man, every light was gathering upon one man, every institution was gradually becoming smaller than the shadow of one man. And here, Caesar's tragedy appears not as a single mistake, but as the almost inevitable result of the entire trajectory of his life. He had gone too far down the road of becoming the center. He had won too much, reformed too much, moved too fast, grown too powerful. Those around him, even those he had once forgiven, those he had helped raise up, those who still lived because of his clemency, now began to feel a quiet unease. If Caesar were to continue, would there remain any space in Rome outside his orbit at all? Perhaps that is the most painful part of this final stage. It was not simply that Caesar had many enemies. A man like him would almost always have to live among rivals. What was more painful was the fact that many feared him not because they had never received anything from him, but the opposite, because they understood too well just how great he had become. They had seen him forgive, they had seen him reform, they had seen him rebuild order, and precisely because they had seen the full scale of that greatness, they no longer believed that any ordinary restraint would be enough to keep him within the old limits. Sometimes power does not collapse because it is weak. It collapses because it is too strong. Those final days in Rome must have carried a very strange atmosphere. Outwardly, it was still the familiar city, temples, the Senate, stone statues, the roads once walked by generations of statesmen. But within that air, surely there were very small changes that Caesar, with all his sharpness, could feel. A few glances lingered too long. A few smiles grew less natural. A few bows carried more ritual than peace. When a man has risen too high, he usually does not lack visible loyalty. What he gradually loses is true security. And then the day of the Ides of March arrived. But if one tells that moment merely as a violent shock, as an action scene cut sharply with cold steel and cries, one loses its true sorrow. Caesar's death was not a bolt of lightning from a clear sky. It was more like a fruit that had long been ripening silently on the branch. The knives were only the final expression of a fear that had been brewing in the heart of the Republic for many years. The fear that Rome would no longer belong to its old laws and balances, but to one man too great to be placed beside anyone else as an equal. He fell at the foot of the statue of Pompey, an image almost too saturated with symbolism to seem like a mere accident of fate. The man who had defeated his old rival, passed through civil war and rebuilt order, now died beneath the stone shadow of a past he himself had once overcome. There is in that a very deep sadness of history. Caesar was too great for the old Republic, yet also too early for the empire that was coming. What makes that death haunting is not violence alone. More haunting still is the paradox. The men who stabbed him believed they were saving the Republic, but they could not restore it whole. They could only halt one form of concentrated power embodied in Caesar. They no longer had the power to turn time backward. On the contrary, his death would open the way to even greater upheavals, to an age in which power would be concentrated on an even broader scale. It is as though, by killing that man, Rome did not kill the future he had opened. It only caused that future to wear a different face. For today's audience, this is perhaps one of the saddest but also deepest chapters in Caesar's story. It reminds us that there are men born to change an order, but precisely because they change it too powerfully, they also awaken the fiercest fear in the hearts of those who live by the old one. The greater power becomes, the less it is opposed by argument alone. At some point, people oppose it simply because they feel that if they do not act now, tomorrow there will be no chance left. And so, Caesar departed this world, not as a man forgotten, but as a question left in the middle of the square. That question did not die with his body. It continued through the centuries, through dynasties, republics, empires, elections, crises, and even into our very modern age. Should a society be saved by the extraordinariness of one individual, or preserved by limits that no one is allowed to stand above? When the blood had dried upon the old stones of Rome, that question was what remained the longest, like a thin yet enduring echo, carrying Caesar's story out of the past, and quietly bringing it ashore in the year 2026, where we still have to ask ourselves what we fear more: the chaos of the crowd, or the light too strong of a single man who can rearrange an entire age. Let the breath slow a little, slow like the lamp in the room being turned down by one more notch, still bright enough for us to see the path, yet gentle enough that the heart does not have to remain awake too long with the unrest of the world. Breathe in as though we are inviting stillness to enter. Breathe out as though we are gently sending the noises of a long day out beyond the door, the streams of news, the arguments, the cold, bright screens, the worries that do not always call themselves by their proper names, so that in this room there remains only the steady rhythm of breath, the softness of darkness, and the story of a man who died more than 2,000 years ago, yet still continues to ask questions of our age. And now, as the story of Julius Caesar has nearly come full circle, we return to the year 2026, our own age, an age that is very fast, very bright, very connected, yet also very easily exhausted. So much information, but not always much wisdom. So many voices, but not always much order. So many people want to change the world, but not all of them understand the price of pushing the world forward too quickly. Perhaps the first lesson Caesar leaves for 2026 is this: power does not begin with a title. It begins with the ability to shape the story that others believe. Caesar was never officially an emperor, yet his name has outlived countless seats of power that once existed in history. Why? Because he did not merely win. He knew how to turn victory into meaning. He knew how to tell the story of himself in such a way that others felt his presence was not an accident, but almost a necessity. And the same is true today. Many people hold office without carrying any real weight. Many possess authority without having true influence. In the end, the one who shapes the way others understand reality is often the one whose power runs deeper than the surface of a title card. But Caesar also reminds us of a second truth, one both compelling and unsettling. Speed can rescue a stagnant age, but it can also leave institutions with no time to breathe. Caesar lived quickly, thought quickly, decided quickly, acted quickly. That very quality helped him rise above a Rome weary from slowness, conflict, hesitation, and decay. There are moments when, without speed, a society will continue sinking into helplessness. An institution will continue growing old. A nation will continue to be bound to frameworks that have already lost their vitality. In that sense, speed is a form of courage, but speed also carries its own shadow. When one person moves too quickly, the structures around him may not have time to adapt. When a leader changes too many things within too short a time, fear often grows no less quickly than achievement. Caesar did not fail only because he had enemies. He also failed because his very swiftness made many people feel that tomorrow there would no longer be any place left for them. For 2026, this is a deeply important reminder. Not everything that is right can be pushed forward at the same tempo. Some changes require strength, but some changes also require breath. Caesar's third lesson may be even more enduring than his victories. A great leader does not only win battles, he must know how to reorganize time, law, and belief. This is the point at which Caesar rises beyond the image of a general. He did not merely conquer Gaul. He reformed the calendar. He reorganized the administration. He touched debt, land, citizenship, colonies, and the machinery of governance. In other words, he understood something that many ambitious people never understand. Breaking things makes a stronger impression than rebuilding them. But it is in the act of rebuilding that history decides how great a person truly is. Our own age is no different. Many people are skilled at pointing out what is wrong. Many are skilled at tearing down what is old. But few possess enough patience, enough intelligence, enough vision to build a new order in which people can actually live, rather than merely cheer around it. Caesar reminds us that the highest talent of power is not to shake the world, but to make the world. After the shaking, capable of standing upon a new foundation. And then comes the fourth lesson, an ancient one, yet still fully modern. The concentration of power can create order very quickly, but it can also create fear very quickly. This is the paradox no age finds easy to resolve. When everything becomes too chaotic, people begin to long for a strong hand, a clear will, a center hard enough to force disorder into silence. Caesar accomplished that. He made Rome move again. He forced the old world to change its shape. But for that very reason, he gradually became too great a shadow for those who still believed in the limits of the Republic. Our own year, 2026, is not far from that same dilemma. Wherever human beings grow weary of fragmentation, they begin to dream of someone who can clean everything up. But the history of Caesar whispers to us in the night. Be careful of every promise of order that arrives too quickly. Sometimes the first thing extinguished is not chaos, but the breathing space of freedom. And perhaps Caesar's greatest legacy is not merely his victories, his reforms, or even his death beneath Pompey's statue. His greatest legacy is a question still vividly alive in the year 2026. Should a society be saved by an extraordinary individual or preserved by impersonal limits? That question has no simple answer. Sometimes it is precisely extraordinary people who open the road to a new age. But often that same extraordinariness can make the rest of society too small, too weak, too dependent. Caesar is both proof of the strength of individual genius and a warning about the price of allowing every current to flow toward the single center. So if there is one thing that remains tonight after this story, perhaps it is a gentle kind of clarity. Treasure those who can set the world in motion, but also remember that a world worth living in cannot depend forever upon one person, however radiant he may be. The most enduring order is not the one that forces everyone to keep looking up at a single face. It is the one that allows human beings to live, breathe, work, trust, and grow old within a frame of life that does not tremble every time one individual changes his mind. And now, as the name Julius Caesar has once again passed through this quiet room, like an ancient flame that has flared up and then softened, we may let the story close very gently. Outside, the world is still fast, still loud, still full of ambitions that have not yet gone to sleep. But here, in the slowing rhythm of the night, perhaps it is enough to remember only this: power may shake history, but only wisdom knows where to stop, so that human beings may still keep their souls.